President William Ruto of Kenya has announced a plan by his government to end the 1.5% levy on digital services. This policy U-turn will see Kenya adopt the contentious global framework on taxing multinationals. While Kenya had been opposed to the framework, proposing a 15% minimum tax rate on global firms, President Ruto has expressed a change in tone, which will see Kenya sign up to the pact by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development ahead of its implementation on January 1, 2024. At the American Chamber of Commerce Regional Business Summit last week, on Thursday, President Ruto addressed investors, saying that his government is committed to reviewing the tax regime and aligning it with the two-pillar solution currently being developed by the OECD Inclusive Framework. Due to the expansion of digital trade, several nations now levy digital services taxes on money earned within borders. Kenya likewise is taking similar action. How very favorable would this be for the government and the multinationals within the digital space in Kenya? So it's about time we find out from our guest, who is joining me from Nairobi, Kenya. His name is Lekan Satchu, Africa Geo-economist, a macro analyst, and CEO, Reach Management. It's nice to have you, Lekan, join us on this conversation. Okay, so I cannot hear you, so you might need to check your device. Okay, beautiful. I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, yes, thank you so much. Let's take a look at the global framework on taxing multinationals. What does it stipulate? Now, why is it contentious by some quarters, and why is President Ruto adopting that tax regime?
So this was the introduction of a 1.5% digital service tax that was brought into play not too long ago. And essentially, President Ruto has removed it and said he's going to abide by the new OECD framework, a framework which might even increase the tax rate that would be applied, but would apply to everybody equally. I think from my perspective, Kenya has a very thriving digital economy. It's nascent, it was fast growing. And I think it was unfortunate where Kenya was seeking to tax it too highly, too early. I think Kenya would be far better off basically getting this economy on an exponential trend before it sought to start milking it with taxes. So I think it's a positive development, but it's also signaling that Kenya will abide by the OECD framework.
All right, if I'm to infer, you're saying that Kenya's digital ecosystem, digital services ecosystem is robust. But I'd like to know what is its economic value, what is its contribution to the Kenyan economy, and how has it complied in terms of tax remittance to the government?
So the estimate that this tax would collect was very low. It was something like $6 million. It wasn't expected to be very high. But the contribution of the digital economy to Kenya's overall economy is pretty substantial. Depends if you want to include telecoms in there. But by my estimates, it's been growing in excess of 20% on a CAGR basis for the last decade, and also has tremendous future potential to drive economic growth in Kenya. We have a very educated workforce. We have a thriving digital economy, and we were just beginning to see a nascent trend of multinationals starting to employ people in Kenya for work that was being delivered abroad. So I think it was important to maintain a low tax framework in order to stimulate job creation. And I think that's what the president has done.
All right, earlier on you said that there's a possibility that tax hike might happen. That would mean that the multinationals would have to pay more. That is, if Kenya embraces the OECD pact, tax regime, and appends its signature to it. So don't you think it would adversely affect these multinationals in terms of what they have to pay compared to what they currently pay?
So that was the point I was trying to bring up. I think, the OECD is trying to create a level playing field. And in fact, the tax regime they're proposing is considerably higher than the tax that Kenya had imposed. I think, when you are a small, nimble economy like Kenya, you want to maintain a lower tax regime than your competitors, just basically to create a tax arbitrage leverage. So I suspect Kenya whilst promising to abide by the OECD framework, is probably thinking that OECD framework is going to take a bit of time to be put in place. And in this interregnum, there's an opportunity to create a favorable tax environment for multinationals, for them to come to Kenya and create jobs and provide services.
All right. Now, according to reports, the Kenya Revenue Authority collected about 174 million shillings in digital service taxes in 6 months, down to December 2022. And it was hoping to best the 241 million shillings that it got 6 months before to June 2022. Now, looking at this, do you think that the government is considering that this tax collection is a bit of underachievement compared to what the digital space rakes in annually?
I think, that number that you've just described is about $2 million. It's insignificant, it's immaterial, and really it's probably more difficult collecting it than the amount you're collecting. So I think they've weighed that in the balance and thought to themselves, look, we've had a history of being ahead of the curve in the digital economy. We had M-Pesa, mobile money before everybody else. Everybody is on a mobile phone. The mobile internet is ubiquitous. Let's now try and give this whole economy more steam and more oxygen for it to grow more quickly. And really, to lose $2 million in tax collection is immaterial. I think that's the calculation that's been made, and I think it's the right calculation.
All right, now with this global tax framework that is being newly adopted by the Kenyan government, would it cover all businesses in Kenya or only multinational companies domiciled in Kenya?
I think it's seeking to cover only multinational companies domiciled in Kenya and multinational companies domiciled in other countries, and create a level playing field for those companies. I think that's the intention behind it. And I think in Kenya's case, obviously, Kenya wants to make the environment here the most conducive for these same multinationals. And I think whilst nodding at the OECD framework, President Ruto is signaling we are more attractive right now if you take into account what I've just announced.
All right, let's look at Kenya's ranking in terms of ease of doing business. It's currently set to be ranked 56th out of 190 countries. Some are saying that this is quite appreciable, but then don't you think this will in some way affect Kenya's ranking in terms of ease of doing business? Or would you say that it's going to improve the value of Kenya's business environment?
So, those ease of doing businesses indexes, I'm quite skeptical about them, because I think, some countries are better at playing the game and understand how to game the indices better. And quite often they don't really sync with what people's experiences are on the ground. I think by removing this tax temporarily, it will boost Kenya's ranking in that index. But I think if you are looking to set up a business in Kenya, you've got to look at the quality of the human capital, the speed with which you can set up your company, the speed with which you can move, the number of laws you've got to comply with. And I think in that context, Kenya has a lot more work to do to make itself more attractive, particularly if it's seeking to compete on a global stage.
Let's go back to the issue of the KRA, that's the Kenya Revenue Authority. Before now, it projected that it was hoping to collect about 13.9 billion shillings from levy within 3 years of application. That is meant to come into effect, or that came into effect rather, January 2021. Now, looking at the adoption of this new tax regime, some are saying that it's a bit of desperation on the part of the Kenyan government and the KRA to meet that target, and not necessarily because of the reasonability surrounding the need for a viable revenue channel for the country. What's your take?
That's an interesting question. And I think clearly, the government's been under pressure to raise the amount of money it's collecting in taxation. And therefore, what's happened is at times that's been in contradistinction to the need to create a favorable environment which creates jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think sometimes you've had the KRA grabbing at potential revenue streams, which if you look at it in a more holistic manner, you'd say to yourself, hang on a second, it's not worth it. Let this economy grow, let it get to a point when it's really meaningful, and then come in and look to tax it. So I think this is a challenge for the government, which is under serious pressure to increase its bottom line, but at the same time, you can't allow the Kenya Revenue Authority to make decisions without considering the entire story. And I think that's what we've seen happen here. And I'm glad to see that the president has reacted quickly. And I think that's precisely what you want to see in the executive, the ability to pivot when the situation demands it.
All right. So finally, Lekan, so we know that a couple of months back, the Kenyan government, the Kenyan president, William Ruto, spoke to the investors talking about how potentially viable and strong Kenya's economy is. And he actually said they would gain more if they choose to invest in the Kenyan economy. So now that we're seeing this interest being shown by these investors and this change in tax regime, do you think that it will solidify the relationship between Kenya and its foreign partners, or you think there will be a bit of friction? Because earlier on you talked about the fact that Kenya is hoping to open up its channels of revenue for more money to come in, but then it could be at the detriment to its relationship with these investors. So where do we draw the line?
So I think, the president, he went to the AmCham, which is the American Chambers of Commerce. He's been on the front foot in drumming up investor interest in Kenya. And I think from my perspective, he's clearly heavily invested in stimulating foreign investor interest and the diaspora and others into the economy. And I think for me, he's made the right decision. And I think he's also shown us in his reaction to this tax issue that he can react when it's required and intervene in a constructive manner. I think, at the end of the day, the KRA have to be cognizant of his drive. I think they will be. And I think over time, you're going to find much more synchronization between the executive and the KRA for the betterment of Kenya Inc., which is the main outcome everybody wants.
All right. Thank you so much, Lekan, for joining the conversation. Appreciate your presence.